dad had just purchased a home for $1,500. December 7th is the day we were moving in. And when that news came on, my dad's face, I just saw his face just drop.
Within hours, the FBI began raiding Japanese American homes up and down the West Coast.
We lived in fear because the FBI came and picked up many of the fathers of the families.
When my father was taken away, I don't think our family knew anything about where he was. This left my mother panicked as to what was going to happen to us.
They were shop owners, language teachers, Buddhist priests, law-abiding citizens. Why the FBI targeted them? They happened to be prominent in the community.
What is your take as a Idaho Libertarian on the effort for Greater Idaho, especially from Oregon?
Yeah, so basically libertarians believe in the freedom of association. And so if the people of Eastern Oregon want to be part of Idaho, I think that deserves to be respected far more than any claims by the government of Oregon that they need to stay with Oregon. There are probably some logistical concerns that the government will need to work out with regard to expense and making sure that laws get enforced and such like that. I think that's far less important than just respecting the freedom of association.
And I'd add to that, there's nothing sacrosanct about the pre-existing borders that weighs in favor of not doing anything. That if there's a good reason, we should reconsider the existing borders and be prepared to accept what the people want.
Can I ask you the same question?
Sure. Well, as libertarians, we like the idea of decentralization. That's the best way to maintain our freedom and liberty. And I see this secession or even redrawing boundaries, as mentioned, as just a progression to that.
With the Greater Idaho movement, what we're trying to do is we have this issue in Oregon where the west side of the state has 90% of the population and the east side of the state has a tenth of the population. And so because those two cultures are very different, whatever the west side of the state decides they want politically, they get, because they have the numbers to outvote the east side of the state. So we have a permanent political minority on the east side of the state.
Although I will just interrupt for a second to say that, I mean, if we look at Salem right now, we don't see either side getting what it wants. We see a strange form of dialogue and non-dialogue.
Well, what you're seeing is these two very different cultures that are clashing. And you have, the east side of the state or conservative people in Oregon in general typically do not have a lot of political power, and they don't have a lot of ability to make political change in this state, and so that's part of why the frustration exists in Eastern Oregon. Eastern Oregon is a very conservative place. It's very similarly minded. People in Eastern Oregon vote about 75% the same way on most issues, and so you have a group of people who's very similarly minded, want certain policies and certain government for their communities, but are not able to get that at the state level.
The thing about the Gorge Commission, it's very policy heavy, and so I think obviously, I'm not sure how familiar people are, but it was created with the National Scenic Area, so that's really the act that gives it the authority. So it was a federal commission, but it's funded and appointed by both Oregon and Washington, and so our budget is broken up between the two states. And so really what we do is we manage the National Scenic Area and the Gorge using a management plan, and the real intent is to protect the National Scenic Area, but also support economic development in the 13 communities along the river. Now, it's hard to not just call things out with the terms that I know of, like, oh, we're gonna group people together based on their values or based on some sort of common thing. That's called segregation, and it didn't work. And so I think, for me, it's really hard because I talk about this term called societal gaslighting, where I grew up from a political family who were tribal leaders, who were spiritual leaders, and I was taught from a very early age about boarding schools, about genocide, about assimilation policy, but these weren't things I was taught in school. And a matter of fact, I was taught why these things were necessary for the industrial age, why these things were necessary for the timber industry. And you know what? Those things are failing now. They're failing every community. All of these sort of ways of making a living, they're not working. And are we dealing with climate change? No. Because everything was carved out for white men of privilege to be able to have these businesses and sustain.
There are people that are critics on a more tribal aspect that said that they, as part of a span of more than just one state in Oregon, and many counties argue that they should have a greater say in not nullifying, but in maybe deriding the idea of Greater Idaho.
Well, I think that just gives the lie to democracy, because ultimately they're saying that they outnumber people and therefore they get to dominate them, and that's not acceptable.
I mean, the walkouts are the exact reason I ran for Senate 2020, even though I was a poor single mother from the reservation, dealing with not having water, dealing with not having childcare, all these things. It's, you know, it's just so maddening to express what societal gaslighting is. The public education I got that normalized racism, everything I've had to do to just exist, the gorge cushion, all these things. I don't want to be doing any of this, but I don't want to be erased, and I don't want my people to be erased, and I don't want the holder of the story to keep telling the story we've been telling, because we're not going to get anywhere if that's what we keep doing.
The idea about diversity and versus homogenous groups comes up a lot, and I think that, you know, people in Oregon who've lived here for any amount of time know that the east side is different than the west side. They're very different cultures, and you can go down almost any issue, and you pick an issue that people vote on, and people on the west side of the state tend to vote one way. They want certain things for their communities, and people on the east side tend to vote the opposite, and they want something else for their communities. Because of where our current state border is, and because it lumps these two groups of very different peoples together, and one of those groups numerically outweighs the other so much, you have Eastern Oregon counties that effectively have no say in their own state government and have policy forced on them that they don't want, and it doesn't make sense for their communities. So it causes a lot of political tension, and so that's why I was talking earlier about where the border is now isn't functional. It doesn't work. It actually causes more problems than it solves. If we moved that border and allowed Eastern Oregon counties to get their state level governance from Idaho, which is the state level government they want and that they vote for every chance they get, then that political tension in Oregon goes away. The walkout that you're seeing in the legislature, that goes away because you have like-minded people in Western Oregon that create policy that makes sense for them, and you allow Eastern Oregonians to go get policy that makes sense for their communities.